On the morning of the 17th of November, 1928, something occurred in Chicago that quietly violated every rule of America's criminal underworld. Inside a private dining room on the fourth floor of the Lexington Hotel, a place that functioned as both fortress and command center, Al Capone sat waiting not for an enemy, not for a rival boss, but for a man who, by the standards of the time, should never have been allowed through the front door. Capone was only 29 years old, yet he already controlled a bootlegging empire worth more than $100 million a year, surviving the bloodiest year of Prohibition by eliminating rivals with ruthless efficiency. He was the most powerful gangster in America and also the most hunted. But this morning, violence could not solve his problem. The threat Capone faced was not coming from Chicago, nor from rival Italian families. It was growing hundreds of miles away, in Harlem, where white gangsters were bleeding money and men trying to seize control of the lucrative numbers racket. The war was expensive, chaotic, and increasingly dangerous. Federal attention was rising. Profits were shrinking. And for the first time, Capone was forced to consider something that violated not only criminal tradition, but America's rigid racial order. The man walking toward his headquarters that morning was Bumpy Johnson, a 23-year-old black numbers enforcer sent by Stephanie Street Claire, Harlem's undisputed gambling queen. His mission was simple to state but nearly suicidal in practice: propose a deal between black and white criminal organizations. At 9:47 a.m., Johnson stepped into the Lexington Hotel under heavy guard. In 1928, segregation was absolute. Most hotels in Chicago wouldn't serve black customers at all, let alone allow them into the headquarters of the most dangerous white gangster in the country. Entering this building uninvited would have meant a beating or a body in the river. But Johnson had been invited. He had been granted safe passage, and Capone had promised that he would leave alive, whether the deal succeeded or not. Still, the risk was enormous. Johnson had been searched twice, carried no weapon, and wore a quiet, expensive suit that signaled wealth without arrogance. He understood one thing clearly: every step he took inside that building was a step closer to either history or death. Inside the dining room, Capone waited with two of his most trusted men: Jake "Greasy Thumb" Guzik, the financial mastermind who managed bribes and political protection, and Frank Nitti, the enforcer responsible for violence when negotiations failed. The table was set with fine Italian food and wine, a deliberate display of power and confidence. When Johnson entered, Capone did something almost unthinkable for a white man in 1928. He stood up and extended his hand. It was not kindness, it was calculation. This meeting, Capone understood, could reshape the future of organized crime, or it could end with blood on the floor. Johnson took his seat carefully, keeping his posture controlled, respectful, but never submissive. In that room, weakness would have been as dangerous as disrespect. Capone poured wine, studied him with the cold patience of a man who decided life and death before breakfast, and finally spoke with a faint smile that carried no warmth. He admitted openly that when his advisors first suggested meeting a black gangster from Harlem, he had laughed. The idea alone violated the unspoken rules of the underworld. White gangs controlled power. Black gangs survived in the margins. That was how America worked on the streets and off them. Johnson didn't flinch. He thanked Capone for the meeting and calmly explained why he was there. Harlem's gambling empire was under siege. White bosses, especially those pushing in from New York, were spending tens of thousands of dollars every month on enforcers, bribes, and violence. Men were dying on both sides. Profits were shrinking. And yet, after months of bloodshed, the attackers still didn't control Harlem. Johnson laid out the reality with brutal clarity. This war was expensive, inefficient, and unnecessary. Then he delivered the line that made the room fall silent. Cooperation, he said, would be far more profitable than conquest. For a moment, it looked like he had gone too far. Capone's advisors stared at him in disbelief. No one spoke to Capone that directly, not without consequences. Johnson met Capone's eyes and didn't look away. He told him that taking Harlem by force would cost more than it would ever earn, and that Capone of all people was smart enough to recognize when business logic mattered more than pride. Seconds passed, the kind of seconds that decide whether a man walks out alive. Then Capone laughed, not mockingly but genuinely. He said he liked Johnson's nerve. Courage like that, he admitted, was rare. Capone leaned forward and asked the real question. What exactly was Harlem offering, and why shouldn't he simply take what he wanted by force? Johnson answered without hesitation. He explained that Harlem's numbers operation generated roughly $20 million a year, clean profit after expenses. Instead of spending $50,000 a month on violence, Capone could take a guaranteed cut millions annually without firing a single shot. In exchange, Harlem wanted autonomy. No expansion into white territories. No challenges to Italian authority. Just the right to run their own neighborhoods without constant war. The proposal was dangerous not because it was weak, but because it made sense. Capone's financial advisor quickly confirmed the numbers. The room shifted. This was no longer a symbolic meeting or a courtesy. It was a negotiation. Johnson pressed further, explaining that Harlem wasn't asking for equality, only stability, tribute in exchange for peace, profit instead of chaos. And for the first time that morning, Capone stopped smiling. He leaned back, silent, calculating the implications, not just the money, but what this would mean for the entire structure of organized crime. Capone remained silent for a long moment, staring past the table as if Harlem itself were laid out in front of him. The money alone was tempting millions a year for doing nothing more than enforcing peace, but that wasn't what finally pushed him. What Johnson didn't yet realize was that Capone had been thinking about the same problem for months. Prohibition had made men rich, but it had also made them careless. Violence was out of control. Federal pressure was building, and deep down, Capone knew that bootlegging would not last forever. When it ended, most gangs would collapse, scrambling for new rackets. The future, Capone believed, wasn't alcohol. It was gambling, and Harlem ran the most efficient numbers operation in America. Capone finally spoke, his voice low and measured. He said he would accept the deal, but not for the reasons Johnson expected. He explained that smart men on opposite sides of a conflict reaching the same conclusion independently was a sign of truth. Fighting over Harlem was bad business. Learning from Harlem was good business. Capone admitted something almost no one expected. Black numbers operators were better than the Italians. Their systems were tighter, their payouts more efficient, their structure more advanced. If gambling was going to replace bootlegging, then ignoring that expertise would be a fatal mistake. Then came the twist. Capone didn't just want tribute, he wanted cooperation. He proposed reducing Harlem's cut in exchange for something far more valuable: knowledge. He wanted Harlem's best operators sent to Chicago to teach his people how the numbers game really worked. And he wanted Johnson to stay, not as a hostage, not as an employee, but as a permanent liaison between white and black criminal organizations across the country, someone who understood both worlds, someone who could prevent wars before they started. Johnson was stunned. This was no longer a protection deal. It was the outline of a national structure, segregated, hierarchical, and secret, but stable. Capone revealed that Harlem was not alone. Black gangsters in other cities had already begun reaching out, asking for similar arrangements. Capone had seen the pattern forming and decided it was smarter to control it than resist it. What he was proposing would quietly reorganize American organized crime along racial lines, parallel systems, defined territories, enforced peace, and guaranteed profit. Johnson hesitated for the first time. Accepting would change his life and Harlem's future. Refusing could restart a war Harlem could not afford. He asked for time to consult Stephanie Street Clare. Capone agreed, but with a warning. The offer was good for 1 week. After that, Capone would step aside and let others fight over Harlem however they wished. The clock had started. When Johnson finally reached Stephanie Street Clare, the conversation was brief but decisive. She understood the danger immediately and the opportunity even faster. Harlem was bleeding. White bosses were pouring money into violence with no end in sight. and federal attention was becoming impossible to ignore. Capone's offer was risky, humiliating to some, but strategically brilliant. Autonomy with protection was something black operators had never truly had. Within days, her answer came back to Chicago. Except, what followed was not a handshake deal, but the construction of a system quiet, methodical, and far more sophisticated than most legitimate businesses of the era. Over several days, the framework was finalized. Black criminal organizations would retain exclusive control over gambling and related rackets in black neighborhoods across major American cities. White organizations would stay out. In return, a fixed percentage of profits would be paid regularly as tribute, not sporadically, not under threat, on schedule, predictable, enforceable. Protection was the real currency. White gangs would prevent other white operators from encroaching. Police pressure would be managed. Raids would decrease or arrive with warnings, and if disputes arose, they would be settled through negotiation before bullets. Johnson's role became central. Operating out of Chicago, he would serve as the bridge, the problem solver, the man who made sure agreements held on both sides. Violence would no longer be the default response. Structure would be. The most radical element remained hidden from almost everyone: knowledge sharing. Harlem's best numbers, men quietly trained Italian operators. Systems were copied, refined, expanded. Gambling operations grew cleaner, more efficient, and vastly more profitable. Money began flowing in ways it never had before, and just as importantly, the streets went quieter. Dutch Schultz and other would-be conquerors backed off, understanding that Harlem was now protected territory. Secrecy was absolute. Publicly, nothing had changed. Segregation remained. Racial hierarchies stayed intact. No one announced alliances. No one claimed partnership. Mid-level gangsters were told only what they needed to know. Certain neighborhoods were off-limits. Certain wars were over. The real structure existed only at the top, protected by mutual interest and silence. By early 1929, the system was working. Tribute payments arrived on time, violence dropped, profits rose. What had started as a dangerous meeting in a hotel dining room had quietly rewritten the rules of the American underworld without a single public declaration. Once the structure was in place, its effects spread faster than anyone expected. Black gambling operations across major cities stabilized almost overnight. Without constant attacks from white gangs, operators could finally invest, expand, and refine their systems. Money that once disappeared into bribes and funerals stayed inside the neighborhoods. Numbers rackets flourished in Harlem, Chicago's South Side, Detroit, and Baltimore, generating millions annually. The arrangement was unequal, but it worked, and in the criminal world, that mattered more than fairness. For white organizations, the benefits were just as clear. Tribute arrived with almost no risk. No turf wars, no drawn-out battles. And perhaps most valuable of all, access to Harlem's superior gambling methods transformed Italian operations nationwide. Gambling replaced bootlegging as the backbone of organized crime, exactly as Capone had predicted. The model proved so effective that when national Italian leadership later formalized their own governing body, they quietly borrowed its logic: territorial boundaries, profit sharing, and dispute resolution before violence. At the center of it all stood Bumpy Johnson. His time in Chicago turned him into something rare, a power broker trusted by both sides. With protection from the top and authority to intervene, he became almost untouchable. Disputes passed through him. Agreements depended on him. Younger black gangsters learned not just how to make money, but how to survive inside a system built against them. When Johnson eventually returned to Harlem, he carried Chicago's backing with him. His rule would last decades. Perhaps the most remarkable outcome was silence. No public acknowledgement, no memoirs, no boasts. Both sides had reasons to hide the truth. White bosses didn't want to be seen cooperating across racial lines. Black leaders didn't want to be seen as subordinate. So the story stayed buried. Historians missed it. Popular culture ignored it. The alliance that reshaped American organized crime remained invisible for generations. What began as a desperate gamble became a blueprint. Stability replaced chaos, profit replaced bloodshed, and one meeting never meant to be known changed the balance of power in the underworld long after both men were gone. The arrangement survived even after its architect fell. When Al Capone was convicted and sent to federal prison in 1931, the system did not collapse. It was absorbed. His successors in Chicago quietly maintained the agreements, and when national Italian leadership later formalized their own governing structure, the same principles were applied: territorial respect, shared profits, and negotiated peace. What had begun as a racial compromise became a foundation for organized crime's modern order. For decades, black gambling operations continued to function under protection, paying tribute but operating with unprecedented autonomy. Some of that money built informal financial networks inside black communities' loans, businesses, and influence, where banks and legitimate institutions refused to operate. It was not equality, and it was not justice, but it was stability in a world designed to deny both. Bumpy Johnson emerged as one of the most powerful figures of the era. His authority rooted not just in violence, but in diplomacy. He understood that survival depended on knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. Eventually, the world changed. Prohibition ended. Gambling gave way to narcotics. Federal prosecutions weakened national crime leadership. A new generation of criminals, unbound by old rules or old loyalties, rejected tribute systems entirely. By the late 20th century, the structure Capone and Johnson built faded into history, not destroyed, but outgrown. And still, the secret remained. What this story reveals is uncomfortable. At a time when American society enforced absolute segregation, criminals found ways to cooperate when profit demanded it, not as equals, not as moral pioneers, but as pragmatists. The alliance did not erase racial hierarchy, it exploited it more efficiently, and yet it reshaped history in ways most people were never meant to know. The meeting at the Lexington Hotel was never supposed to be remembered, but it explains why some men became untouchable, why certain wars never happened, and why the underworld evolved faster than the society above it. Sometimes, the truth isn't hidden because it's unimportant, but because it complicates everything we think we understand.